talk is part of a year-long lecture series called the Ralph Nuzum Lecture Series. Tonight we have Dr. Anna Pidgeon. She's a professor of forest and wildlife ecology at UW-Madison, and she's here to talk to us about the impacts of development on bird diversity. So I'm going to pass this around. Please sign in. I need to keep track of attendance for grant purposes. And I'll hand it over to Anne. Thank you. Great. Thank you very much.
So how many folks are here from Lafarge? Okay, and Rural Club. Hillsborough, oh yes, that was yes, okay. Hillsborough, okay. And Viola. Okay, Viola. Okay.
Toma.
Toma, no, I don't know who said that. Wow, present, great, okay. Other places further afield than Toma?
Holman.
Holman? Holman?
Holman.
Oh, I was thinking Pullman, Washington. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. I've been studying birds for about 20 years now, and some of you may remember, if you've been coming to this series, Eric Wood, who was my student and presented on how different tree species here in the Kickapoo Reserve, but more broadly in the driftless area and the Midwestern forests, are useful to birds as they're migrating from northern South America and Central America to their breeding ground further north from here. And so he had found that oaks and the lack of fire that oaks are very important to migrant birds as a refueling and a quick refueling source when they're resting on migration, and that the lack of regeneration of oaks potentially causes a problem in the future. And I have other students who look at other aspects of how human actions or lack of actions may affect wildlife, but more specifically birds. And for example, looking at lake development on birds that are flycatchers that pursue insects that fly in the air, and another student looking at the effects of recreational trails on bird breeding habitat. And I'm going to talk today about the effects of housing development on bird diversity. What do you think? Does housing, when I talk about housing, I'm talking about the structures we all live in, the yard, the driveway that comes up to it, does that have an influence on birds? Sure. Positive, negative? In what ways? Ideas?
Well, more birds there than in a cornfield, probably.
More birds, okay, because of
More diversity.
more vegetation diversity, more insects maybe, yeah? Other ways?
Sometimes like a nesting habitat, barn swallows, for example, using the buildings.
Right, so birds nest on, or structures, robins nest on top of lights, or phoebes nest under the eaves, barn swallows as you mentioned. So it certainly benefits, housing benefits some species. Feeders, out here, people put up bluebird houses, that benefits a lot of species as well. There's some groups of birds though that are not benefited by housing, and I want to talk today about some of the ways that birds are impacted. And particularly species that nest on or close to the ground, like within a meter of the ground, can be pretty negatively affected by housing. So examples of some of those species here that are found in the driftless area, let's see if I can use this, include blue-winged warbler, for example. So it's a species that nests on edge of forests or in openings within the forest and puts its nest close to the ground. And it forages, I should have said, in the middle to upper canopy, often hanging upside down and picking insects off of the leaves. Another species that nests on the ground, I heard many of them when I walked around for a few minutes earlier tonight, are eastern towhees. Here you see a female, the males replace that brown with black, and you have a male, and they put their nests often at the base of a shrub in a cup nest on the ground. Another example that you may find in deep forest here is the ovenbird. And this is a species named for the oven-shaped nest that it makes. You can see the female looking out at us. And this bird, in contrast to the previous two that put their nest in dense vegetation, this species puts its nest in open forest floor situations. So the arrow is pointing to an ovenbird nest there. And so it relies on the camouflage. These are not the same two nests. So here it would incorporate leaves into its nest. So it's virtually impossible to find unless you step on it and you flush that adult who's in the nest. Oh, I should have pointed out, you see the adult with a caterpillar in its mouth. Caterpillars are really important foods for nesting songbirds like all of these that we've looked at so far. They are easy to digest, they don't have a lot of hard parts, they have a lot of lipids or fatty parts and protein as well, and so they're important both for the nesting female, to give her energy, the incubating female, as well as for feeding the babies inside the nest. So, species that nest on the ground are, of course, vulnerable to predation from predators that forage on the ground. And I'm not meaning to say anything negative about predators, at least not about our native predators. They have evolved to make their way by eating native songbirds as well as a variety of other species as well. I do want to talk about cats though for a second. Cats are not a native predator. They're not part of the native fauna that birds evolved with or any other species evolved with. And in my opinion, cats need to be in houses or not unrestrained and not unsupervised outside. And feral cats don't belong in our forests or in our wild areas. They either need to be tamed or humanely euthanized as a last resort. They strongly impact bird communities, and in fact, when we look at human impacts, like direct impacts, human-caused impacts, or bird window collisions, building collisions, cats are number 2. So as a direct result of humans, cats are number 2. So predators make a big impact on bird nesting success. And some predators that you may not think of as typical bird predators include several rodent species, so gray squirrels, red squirrels, white-footed mice, chipmunks, all can be either nestling or egg predators as well. And whereas the rest of the year they can get by on less protein, on grains and vegetation, they also need protein for their developing babies, and so they take protein where they can get it. So all of these predators, however, well, I guess I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So now I want to switch from thinking about birds that nest on the ground, predators that encounter birds that nest on the ground, to thinking about housing for a second. And so when we think about housing, especially in forested areas, maybe this is a idyllic or the dream house for many people. Housing in and near forests come in many shapes and sizes, and these are some pictures I've taken from when I was doing some work on birds in the Baraboo Hills. So houses can be very modest size or larger with a pretty closed canopy overhead, as you see those two on the left, or they can make a much larger footprint. They can remove a lot of the previously present forest vegetation and replace it with lawn. Both of these places making a really hard edge. And along with forests come people, of course, and the yards, like we just saw, and then the people's pets, and chickens now these days. And with pets and the chickens come a lot of food, resources for predators. The chickens are pretty sloppy, as those of you who have chickens know, and that can attract a whole variety of predators trying to eat up the food. Both dogs Does unrestricted predators affect birds nesting on the ground, but also in both of these cases, predators like raccoons and opossums and skunks are attracted to backyard food bowls, and the abundance of these predators is higher in the vicinity of houses than it is out in natural forest. So houses attract predators. Some of our feeding, so we like to attract birds to take a look at them, but of course we're also putting out then that rich food resource for predators again. This little guy's pretty funny. He only could get into this feeding tube when the level of the birdseed got low enough so he could get in here, and then he had to be let out again. So the bird species that I showed you evolved in, they're all species of the eastern US, and they evolved in this kind of context. This is a picture taken from Wildcat Mountain. So contiguous forest context, large unbroken tracts, and they've been successful in that context. And I guess I got ahead of myself. So this whole area, if you look at the different legends, it doesn't really matter, but I just wanted to show this whole area in pre-settlement times before Euro-Americans came and opened up the landscape was pretty contiguous forest. Okay, I think I have this a little bit out. Oh, wait, excuse me. Okay, so another issue that, or another group of birds that are negatively affected by housing are those species that require large tracts, and then they need to nest in the interior of those tracts. So they're what we call forest interior species. And one example of such a species is the red-shouldered hawk. It nests, a study in the upper Midwest suggested that a 200-acre tract is about the minimum. And it nests often near seeps or springs or streams, but not only, in the interior of forests. And as forest patches get smaller, or as you move toward the edge of forest, it's replaced by red-tailed hawks. Another interior forest species is the Akkadian flycatcher. It nests often in situations like this, ravines, the deepest, darkest parts of the forest. And it's a stronghold for it in Wisconsin is here in the driftless area, also in the Baraboo Hills. We're in the very northern edge of its range, and it's listed as a state threatened species, but it seems to be holding its own. It's not declining, it's remaining quite stable. So this it makes a ridiculously inadequate nest, don't you think? That bird looks like that's the female, that's not a baby, going to burst out of the nest, and they put it on these little spindly twigs, in the V of a little spindly twig, way out away from the trunk of the tree, and I tried to put sensors near their nest. It's just impossible to get out there, so I admire it from a predator prevention point of view. They often place it so that they've got this little leaf cap over the top of them, and out on a spindle, it's really hard to get to them at all. Okay, but forest interior species. And another species, also of high conservation status in Wisconsin, and is the Cerulean Warbler, and I'm sorry I can't say that its populations are holding their own here. They're rapidly declining throughout the entirety of its range. And this is a species that not only requires big blocks of forest, nesting in the interior of them, but it also seems to prefer to nest in areas with pretty old trees, so big diameter trees. And then a species that has kind of two strikes against it in terms of trying to maintain itself in an anthropocentric world is the Kentucky warbler. But again, the driftless area is a stronghold for this species in Wisconsin. And again, by the way, it's in the northern edge of its range here. So this species both nests on the ground, as you can see here, but it's also a forest interior species. So nests on the ground in the interior of forests. So it, throughout its range, is also declining. So we saw this picture of unbroken habitat, unbroken continuous forest that was the state that this diverse group of songbirds evolved in. And in much of the eastern forest, what's happened over time is that contiguous forest, so here we have a fall scene with many of the brown trees are deciduous and have already lost their leaves, and you can see the yellow leaves are turning. You can see that this forest is punctuated by home sites, the lawns there, and how that breaks up the forest. And if we zoom in a little bit closer, you can see the streets and how it's not one big block. There's lots of edges in this forest, lots of smaller patches. And then finally, getting to the ground level, this is a new development being created, and it isn't a big thoroughfare by any means. This is the roundabout to a housing development, but look at how big the stretches are between sides of the forest. So this is a really different context than many of these birds grew up, or evolved in, not grew up, but evolved in. So this process that we've been looking at is forest fragmentation, and that also often accompanies housing development. And as housing density increases, we get more and more fragmented patches of forest. And so as you move from contiguous to even reasonably low housing density, we shift from having lots of interior to lots of edge habitat, and that shifts the balance of suitable habitat for many different species. And so, for example, it decreases suitability for red-shouldered hawks, and it increases suitability for red-tailed hawks, and which is more abundant here in the state. We have many red-tailed hawks. You know, it's not their fault. They're taking advantage of, they're thriving in the habitat that we've created. But we have less and less red-shouldered. So, as habitat is fragmented, we have changes in the physical conditions of the interior forest versus the edge forest. We have natural behaviors of predators to contend with, and then we have the natural behavior of a bird species, the brown-headed cowbird, to contend with, and all of these cause problems for lots of bird species. So I want to talk about the physical conditions for a second. So think about, for example, for a minute, being in the interior of a forest, and then in your imagination, put yourself on the edge of the forest instead. And what are some of the differences?
Light.
Light.
Noise.
Noise. Great. Temperature, which is what's different? Don't know.
Cooler in the forest.
Cooler in the forest.
More damp in the forest interior.
Humidity is higher. If it's a breezy day, what's the difference between the edge and the interior? It's quieter, the wind doesn't penetrate far. It does penetrate some distance, but doesn't penetrate far into the interior. I think we hit them all. I'm really impressed. It's great. So, for some of the species that we've been talking about that are forest interior species, it's not completely clear what it is about the interior that they require. Like, why can't a Cerulean Warbler succeed nesting in smaller diameter trees? Why does it require the big ones? We don't know. What's the reason? But we do, and some species seem to be quite disturbed by noise, by human presence. Potentially they can adapt. We never thought that eagles would be a species that nests close to people. We've seen many species adapt. So maybe species can adapt to human disturbance, to the louder noises that exist near roads like this. But some things are definitely different, and you hit on some, the temperature, wind, and humidity. So birds are feeding their babies, feeding the incubating adult. soft-bodied insects, the humid conditions within the interior of forests create conditions for a much higher abundance of soft-bodied insects. And that abundance, we think, contributes to high nest success of many species that are in the interior. And both soft-bodied caterpillars like this, and also invertebrates that are in the forest floor litter are at higher abundance in the interior. And just imagine sun beating down on the forest edge, the litter in the forest edge, and you can see why there's a lot less abundance of those insects there. So that's one of the reasons that fragmentation creates problems for forest interior species. Another is that predators, like people too, like to walk along edges. And rather than going through the middle, they'll often hunt and just travel, just have natural paths, they're creatures of habit, and they use forest edges to get from one place to another. And so we have a lot more activity by these species in the edge habitat when we fragment the forest. Birds that are predators on birds or eggs also like to perch in the forest edge and just observe. Since they're perched, they're hunting perch. And again, I like blue jays and I like American crows a lot. This is to diss any predators, to speak negatively of them, but they're more abundant at edge. In fact, I put up a chart here from a study that was in Ohio forest where it's BLJA stands for blue jay, and this stands for American crow. This is brown-headed cowbird, and the black columns are edge habitat. The study was over 2 years, 1998 and 1999, and you can see in every case there was higher abundance of predatory birds in the edges, dark columns, than there were in the interior areas, spots where the researchers looked in both years and for all these 3 species that they looked at. So predators are more likely, so when we fragment forests, we're exposing all the birds that nest in those forests to more predation pressure, both from mammals and from predatory birds. And finally, this species, the brown-headed cowbird, that's many. How many of you know about the brown-headed cowbird? Oh, everybody, almost everybody. All right, I'll be quick then. So traditionally, its habitat was the Great Plains and open mountain meadows in the west. It followed bison, elk, as they as they're constantly on the move during the summer especially, and put its eggs in other birds' nests. We call those host birds, so they could follow along with the bison and forage at their feet. As we opened up the forest, we saw a big increase in abundance of brown-headed cowbirds on surveys. And when they lay their eggs in other birds' nests, the nestling is larger than the host babies. The nestling can reach up higher and get the food that the pseudo mom and dad, or the adoptive mom or dad for this one, brings, weakening these birds. It also can back up underneath them and push them out over the edge of the nest. Same with eggs. It's a very successful, adaptive, amazing adaptation that the bird has. It's not its fault. But what often happens is that the host, in this case the yellow warbler, parents end up raising the brown-headed cowbird baby and not their own, or potentially one of their own, a far reduced clutch, a far reduced set of babies. So as we've fragmented the forest, provided bird feeders, lawns, horses, cows in the eastern US where they weren't before, and where these eastern species had not evolved in the presence of cowbirds, we've created a lot of situations where nest success is pretty low for these species. They have many nest failures. So I want to show you that the results of a study that was done in the Midwestern US a few years back, but it still is really hits home for me the effects of forest fragmentation on birds. So a bunch of 20-kilometer circles were the study areas, and they were located in the contiguous forest area of the Northwoods, the Ozarks, about half of them were there, and then they were also located in fragmented forest patches in the middle of those two contiguous forest areas. So the fragmented patches look like this, with little patches of forest, and the contiguous forest patches look like that. So an army of undergraduates went out and monitored nest success over several years for, these are the 9 most common bird species. All these 4-letter codes are what birders use for shorthand for different birds' names. So the codes over there match the codes on these charts. And what we have in these charts is the percent of the landscape that was forested, from little to 100%. And then along this y-axis we have nest mortality. So how likely on any given day is a nest to be eaten? Typically mortality is due to be eaten unless there's a big storm. And for every species you can see that there's some degree of this direction of the line, which means that where there was little forest in the landscape, nest mortality was really high. And where there was a lot of forest in the landscape, nest mortality declined. So in every case, or for all of these species, although the effect size differs by species, they all did better in more forested landscapes. A big example of fragmentation. So the researchers next did kind of a thought experiment. What if we pretended that each of those landscapes was a closed population, so that the number of babies produced by the adults that were there and their progeny were the only ones that contributed to the population size for 20 years? Would the population, would the number of babies that are being produced each year sustain the population, or would it go extinct? What would happen? And they were only able to do that for the 3 birds on which they had the most data. And I apologize, these lines got shifted a little bit. But what we see here is the black lines are those models for those contiguous forest habitats, the highly forested landscapes. Whereas the red lines are the models for the landscapes that were in the center, the very fragmented landscapes. And what you see is that in every, and it goes from 1 year to 20 years, and what was the population size after 20 years. And we see that in the continuous forest landscapes, says Wisconsin and Missouri continuous forest, Wisconsin and Missouri continuous forest, and up there as well, Wisconsin and Missouri, the populations, the adults were producing enough young that the populations increased. They're all increasing. But in the fragmented landscapes, fragmented forest landscapes, all of them went extinct at some point. I added these red lines so that we could tell the difference here, so that's why it's all, and then my computer shifted them off. But anyway, the point is the populations in fragmented landscapes are not producing enough young to replace themselves. But yet we have hummingbirds and wood thrushes and other forest birds in fragmented patches, in small patches. So where are they coming from? They're being subsidized by the birds producing surplus young, both in the Northwoods and in the Missouri Ozarks, according to this population model. So fragmented patches often are what we would call a sink. They're not producing enough to replace the young. So, given the rate of mortality that we saw with the army of undergraduates collecting data, the fragmented forest landscapes didn't have populations that could sustain themselves. Questions about that? Okay, then I want to switch gears a little bit and look at, housing density across the United States through decades. And this is a map that's developed by my lab from census data. So we can see it every decadal point, 1970, so 80. I should have stopped and said, so where you see it's black, it's no housing, and where it's very bright red, it's the highest housing, whoops, darker red, it's the highest housing density. And so you can, I don't know, pick your favorite spot and look at how things move over time. So we're at 1980, 1990, 2000. So we wanted to link information about housing density with information about birds, and specifically in forests. And the way that we linked birds to landscapes was to use data that's been collected by the federal government, well, organized by the federal government, but collected by volunteer citizen scientists since the 1970s, actually since 1966 on the East Coast, in what's called the Breeding Bird Survey. And this survey, volunteers say, well, the USGS says, we have these 25-mile stretches of secondary road, look like this, that we need to have surveyed once a year, same stretch of road once a year. And the protocol is that two people drive the route on a day in June during the nesting period, and they stand every half mile, they get out of the car and they stand there for 3 minutes and scan for and listen to both orally and visually listen for birds, and one person records all the birds detected while the other person is mentioning them as fast as that person hears them. So here's, for example, the routes in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. You look across the country, each of these dots represents one of these 25-mile routes. So it's the North American Breeding Bird Survey, and it's a gold mine of information. Having this big a stretch, over 40 years of information, allows us to put it together, for example, with census data and look at patterns. And the way that we specifically link the data on the bird survey to housing is here, for example, we see a route from northern Wisconsin. It's the same route, but here you see it overlaid with land cover. So the green is forests, and blue is lakes. And here you see it overlaid with housing density from the census. And here's the route from just south of Madison. The colors, the light orange and the yellow, indicate both pasture and row crops. So here's land cover, and here's housing density. And you can see how high the housing density is there. So we put that data together. And these circles are the same size circles as you saw in that previous study, about 20 kilometers across. I don't know why, okay, sorry. And then we look at the birds from big sections, big ecoregions, in groups according to something they have in common. For example, according to where they nest on the ground. Or do they travel very long distances from the neotropics? Or are they permanent residents? Or are they species that are closely affiliated with with people like house wrens and house sparrows and house finches, or they nest in cavities? So we call these guilds. So we interested in how these different guilds, and remember we talked about how sensitive these are to housing, how they react to housing. So I looked at this question just for the forested regions of the country, and so what you're looking at here is housing density per that circle, that 20-kilometer circle. It's 1,200 kilometers when you figure out the acreage, but and I've arranged them from the lowest housing density to the highest housing density regions and put a bunch of arrows in so you can see where those are located. As you would expect, the highest housing density region is over here on the east coast. And this is housing density in the vicinity of those circles. Remember that route was a secondary road? You didn't see a lot of housing along it. And yet, housing density, so we've got the 4 decades for each route. So housing density in 2000 was about 65 houses per square kilometer, most dense, whereas in the Rocky Mountain ecoregion, even in the year 2000, it was only about 3 or 4 houses per kilometer. So a huge difference in terms of the housing density and all the associated stuff, the yards, the streets, among these different ecoregions. So I want to show you the relationship between birds and housing in just 3 of those ecoregions. This again is that southern Rocky Mountain one, the lowest housing density, the highest housing density ecoregion, and then we took one in the middle. It's also our backyard, if you will, the Northwoods. So in that eastern deciduous forest ecoregion, there were pretty high housing density along the secondary roads in 2000. And what we see here is, again, the 4 decades lined up with 4 columns for each group of species. And the reason all the bars are pointing downward is because the relationship between birds and housing was negative in every decade and for every one of these groups. So the more housing there was, the fewer forest species there were, the fewer cavity nesters. No matter how you sliced or diced it, there were fewer. The reason there's absent bars here, or there's missing bars here, is that there were a couple groups for which there was a neutral or no relationship. So synanthropes, those species that are affiliated with people, housing density was so high, is so high in this eastern deciduous forest that they kind of permeate. You can't see where there's high housing, more of them, low housing, less of them. It's just kind of evenly dispersed, so no relationship at all. But whereas you can see here with interior forests, the more housing, the fewer of them there are. As the decades go on and housing density increases, there's fewer of those species. Yes?
Why did, for the most part, in 1980, they...
You get a big bump?
Yeah.
That's a great question, very perceptive. So what you're... Oh, you don't get it. Actually, you get a recession here. Okay.
Well, would that be getting better?
It is getting better, but it's interesting. We have a jump ahead. Can we just hold on to your question for a second, because you're going to see the opposite pattern when we get to our region. Yeah, I don't know why things got better, as you say, in 1980 for the eastern deciduous forests. That's a great question. I haven't actually thought about that one before. Okay, so that was the highest density area. Then we go to the lowest density one. It's 3 houses per square kilometer in the year 2000. And we see a lot of missing bars, a lot of neutralness, not really much effect. When you have very low housing density, it's neutral, or it even brings in resources that weren't there previously, but the housing isn't so high that it's excluding, for example, forest interior species. So a lot of positive relationships at that housing density level. Then, moving to the Northwoods forests, there's relatively low housing density at 10 compared to the 64 in the eastern, and yet we have virtually all negative relationships. So this is the Northwoods, northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And here's what I was asking you to hold off for, because we see an increase in negative effect in 1980 here. And there was something in the 1970s, it was a decade that was called the Rural Renaissance. Many people, or it was the first point in census in the U.S.'s history where there were more people moving out to exurban or rural areas and were moving into urban areas. And so there's a big building boom in the 1970s in rural areas, retirement homes, etc., and people wanting to move back to the land. So that's how we explain this big jump here in negative relationship in our Northwoods. But I'm not sure about the eastern corridor there. So we see negative relationships for many birds, many sensitive bird species, ground nesters, interior nesters, etc. Neutral or maybe positive, but from one little bar like that, we don't make much out of it for cavity nesting species. And then permanent residents, chickadees, I should say these groups are not mutually exclusive. So chickadees, downy woodpeckers, nuthatches, etc., they're all quite positively affected by ex-urban housing. And then of course synanthropes are as well. So then finally, when we look at all of the forested regions of the country put together, we see this pattern. So it's quite different than what we've seen so far. So we see some positive or neutral relationships. What really stands out here is that ground nesting species have each year an increasingly negative relationship with housing, so that means we're seeing fewer species on these, fewer ground nesting species on these routes with the 4 advancing decades. The relationship with synanthropes is an increasingly positive one. And the rest, it's hard to say, but permanent residents, this looks like a trend. Cavity nesters seem to be favored as well. The rest, not much. So, in my mind, this is somewhat hopeful in that if you look at the entire contiguous US at that scale, there's a lot of room for making decisions about protecting habitat. We haven't done a huge amount of damage with the exception of ground nesters, of course, so far. So we put all this together, kind of a conceptual idea of the relationship between housing and birds is that as we go through time from colonization and then forward, we see in the initially there's some general number of species. Species richness just means number of species. And as people move in, that number stays the same, or it may even increase if people bring in additional resources, open up the forest a little bit, but not so much that it makes interior forest species vanish, for example. But with that initial seed of housing colonization or development, people tend to settle near each other, and species richness declines over time. And it never ever gets to zero because we have protected areas like refuges, national forests that are never going to have housing inside them, easements, etc. So initially we have a positive relationship, then it goes negative, and then it'll settle at some lower point, some point in the future. And that where it settles depends on our decisions about how to zone, for example, how to allocate a lot of different development decisions. Okay, so this just says in words, first there's a positive or at least a neutral association, then a negative association as houses become prevalent. The time to be really efficient about conservation is early. By the time you have negative relationships, we certainly can do conservation, but it's more expensive. Think about any of the species on the endangered species list. It takes a lot of resources to rehab them, to regain their populations, versus making decisions about zoning early and not letting them get to that point. Okay, so when housing is in the landscape, the ecological integrity, so what the conditions were in pre-settlement, declines. And some species lose out, some species gain, have robust populations. The losers tend to be those that are very specific in their habitat requirements. and specific in ways that contradict our tendencies for developing land. So they require big trees. We like to cut down big trees because they give us a lot of resources to use. They need big tracts of unbroken forest, or they nest on the ground. Whereas species that are doing well are generalists, can use shrubs and hedges to advantage. Okay, I asked our lab technician if he would give me some maps looking at housing density in the driftless areas specifically. And so here, to orient you, here's Prairie du Chien, here's La Crosse in Alaska, and this is Fort McCoy, so Toma would be down here. And let's see, this is the Chippewa River and Lake Wissota, I think it is, just east of Chippewa Falls. So here we are. So
Those are county blocks.
these are what are called census blocks. So no, they're not counties, they're smaller than that. They're what the Census Bureau uses. So the name comes from cities where it's literally a city block, but they use political boundaries and then natural boundaries like rivers, a variety of boundaries. And then and another example is when something changes ownership, say from a county to a municipality. So that's why they're a little oddly shaped. Yeah. All right, so here we have 1970, and again, you see the legend here is the same as before. So black and dark green are the lowest housing density, and dark red is highest. 1980, 90, 2000. 2010, and then we have forecast using a set of decision rules based on housing growth in the past, assuming it would grow in the future and around the nuclei that are already there. So here's 2020, 2030, 40, 50, and I'm going to jump down to 2100. So these maps and data were designed for kind of strategic decision-making at big scales, not for township level planning. But it does give you an idea of where are the most vulnerable areas, and if there are particular landscape elements that are of prime importance to think about those right now.
Well, and even where it's green at the bottom, a lot of that could be corn and cropland, so I mean, it's not like it's all forest down there, is it?
Oops.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah, it might not be.
You're right, this is strictly houses. Yep, that's true. So, yeah, so I just had
It
these
looks
put
better,
together
it looks
on
better than
Monday.
it probably is.
Okay, that's a good point. Right, so in the others I had land cover in with it, but here I don't have land cover as well. So I will open it up to questions. I'm sensitive to being warm in the room, and let's just see where, if you have questions. Yeah?
A lot of us own rural lands.
Yeah.
What would be your suggestion for the width of a forest trail?
Of a
Should we
forest
try
track.
trail? Should we try to maintain canopy?
Yes.
Should it be 3 feet? Should it be 9
We
feet?
should try to maintain canopy, but I know that many forest trails are built on old logging roads or other kinds of roads, and it seems from our work that the wider the trail, the bigger the change, the impact, that's exactly what I was saying. So if you can let some of it revegetate with native plants, not invasives, that's a better.
Well, we're talking in terms of
Yeah.
3 to 5 feet.
Yep. So there's trail associations in many states, and including in Wisconsin, there's a state trail coordinator, so like the Glacial Ridge Trail and other things, and they make what they call constructed trails, which are just very narrow tread, and they try to not break the canopy at all. And those seem to be better